Though there is much more that might be said about the importance of reorienting journalism and multimedia public affairs content in accord with complex systems and integrative principles. Before drawing these comments to a close, I want to address two questions. Number one, who is the imperative report meant for? And number two, how challenging might the content produced for the imperative report become? First, let me emphasize that the imperative report will be designed to invite not merely passive program viewing, but active audience content production participation as hinted at before. In short, the vision is for the gradual, though hopefully viral, organic growth of an audience that may be as much prosumer participants in a range of ways as they feel inspired or able to be. That said, it may also be useful to first briefly offer the contrapositive case of those for whom the imperative report may have little attraction. It may not be for those wedded to left-right conservative progressive tribalism, or those obsessed with following every trivial Twitterverse distraction, or those who never consider whether the content or framing of what appears on the major media 24/7 microsecond news cycle venues in an unceasingly repetitive rehashing is actually worthy of attention, or who conflate the endless verbal and emotional jousting of talking heads opining on these venues to be synonymous with news. It is not meant for those with attention spans too short to consider that issues and problems having multiple and complex causes are unlikely to be amenable to soundbite analysis, let alone obvious or necessarily simple solutions. It may not be for those who are resigned, fatalistic, or so cynical that they believe that our challenges are so locked in by existing powers that be that they cannot imagine that even such an expanded and more substantive form of journalism has any hope of contributing to changing them. Conversely, the imperative report certainly is meant for all those constructively challenged and energized by truly considering reality in its rich complexity, who sense or firmly recognize that we live not merely in very demanding, challenging, and even dangerous times, but also in enormously exciting times. Those who sense or firmly recognize that most, if not all, of the greatest challenges facing us simply are systemically connected and could generally be much more productively assessed and governed through means which explicitly acknowledge this, and that the consequences and potentials of that connectedness are of enormous interest and importance. It is meant for those concerned with remaining apprised of how these dynamic linkages unfold, whether they are being constructively guided or not, and who recognize that conventional media venues do not provide such integrated and sustained coverage, but wish for a fourth estate that would do so. It is certainly meant for a global audience attuned to the extent that many of our greatest challenges are of a cross-border commons nature, an audience of cultural creatives, an audience of both progressives and conservatives who recognize that many of the criteria defining those political labels have become at least rearview mirror anachronisms, and at worst, counterproductive if not irrelevant diversions. An audience that recognizes that while economic competition can be healthy, broader social and institutional cooperation and constructive engagement across academic, geographic, and policy boundaries may be the most underutilized resource at our disposal, precisely because so many of our grand challenges are of a complex and highly interpenetrating nature, begging for a different kind of reportage as well as governance. Through this preliminary outreach, the imperative report is meant to call on academics and authors having expertise in complexity and system studies to offer proposals for which tectonic driver or grand challenge categories they consider most important, especially those relevant to the planetary boundaries construct. and that they would like to see receive the kind of sustained integrated coverage that the Imperative Report is conceived to provide, to offer their best judgments about the networks of systems and subsystems linking to and from those categories, and what their feedback and/or feed-forward structures might be. It is meant for professional journalists, either employed or those unemployed due to years of digital disintermediation, inspired to be a participant in this vision. Journalists thematically strongly interested in a particular grand challenge or tectonic driver, and drawn to the prospect of mediating content production for that domain, interested in mentoring, guiding, and collaborating with a growing international cadre of citizen, student, and other professional journalists, excited by the vision of the Imperative Report and hungry and enthusiastic to have a venue enabling them to build a portfolio of contributions. And there is one at least partial precedent for the kind of globally distributed journalistic coordination envisioned here, that conducted by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists in their notable efforts in uncovering and exploring the Panamanian tax and financial haven revelations. And the Imperative Report is meant to challenge deans and administrators of schools of journalism and communications to actually walk the talk of breaking down silos, to work with us, and to consider allowing substantive student contributions to these Imperative Reports to qualify to receive credit toward their degrees for these contributions. It is meant for all of those of any generation who refuse to be shamed out of the authentic enthusiasm of their idealism by the perverse peer pressure of a cheap fatalistic cynicism, and to leverage the often cited idealistic aspirations and energy of the millennial generation, and to invoke and revive the age of Aquarius spirit of a baby boomer generation, many members of which may sense that the potential greatness of the idealism of their youth has never been fully realized, but yet might be. It is absolutely meant for all of those, irrespective of nationality or political or ideological affiliation, who vaguely sense or firmly realize that a great deal of the pervasive, increasingly troubled perception that something is deeply amiss with our governance traces back to the failure of these processes to evaluate and address issues systemically and in an integrative manner, and who would recognize the potential significance of a fourth estate which made redressing such a deeply fundamental flaw to be very high. In this respect and others, the Imperative Report is ambitious, and it invites the energies and the spirit of the ambitious, the realistic, but also the idealistic and the enthusiastic. And I would especially emphasize enthusiasm, because recognition of how transcendent the best case scenarios lying before us might be, may be the indispensable antidote needed to counter the inertia and defeatist resignation which could all too easily allow a slide into the horrific worst case scenarios all too easy to imagine. And to recipients of this introduction who may have the resources, if not for the overall vision, perhaps there will be a specific tectonic driver or grand challenge that you feel especially needs sustained and integrated coverage, and will feel inspired to underwrite that aspect of the Imperative Report. Finally, from the very inception of the Imperative Report, as this preliminary outreach suggests, collaboration is in its operational DNA. In answer to the second question regarding how challenging the Imperative Report content might become, let me provide two brief examples. In a deeply sobering but very important talk before a meeting of the Sustainable Consumption Research and Action Initiative Organization, or SCORE, the acronym, in 2014, MIT professor and head of the MIT Systems Dynamics group cited before, John Sterman, laid out some of the complex nesting of causal and feedback structures characterizing our current social, economic, technological, political, and ecological circumstances, and the dire consequences attendant to continuing with the rates of compound growth inherent to the business-as-usual assumptions which persist in dictating so much of the policy landscape. Perhaps more by intellectual and institutional inertia and failure to truly grasp the gravity of our situation than by reason. One of the most important conclusions to emerge from his analysis is that it is a deeply naive and fallacious to believe, as so many policymakers seem to as virtually a matter of unquestioned faith, that we will be saved by technology and allowed to indefinitely continue compounding our population and economic growth and consumption. But the importance of that assumption being incorrect is so great, and the implications so far-reaching, the fact that this issue is not even raised by the conventional public affairs news media, let alone explored in a sustained manner to the depth and breadth that it would deserve to be, can be taken as a very telling symptom of just how dysfunctional and myopic the condition of our fourth estate has become. As can the fact that our mass media would rather give uncounted hours of coverage to the often pathetically adolescent and or self-aggrandizing statements of a reality TV personality posing as president, rather than listen to the important voice of someone like Professor Sterman. To be continued.